right, let's get started with talking about the early English colonists. There are other colonists. There's French, there's Spanish. They're kind of spread out across the continent, but our main focus is going to be on the British. So let's talk about the colonial era. As I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, there are three themes of the early English colonies: religious liberty, economic freedom, and political protection. In this video, we're only going to talk about religious liberty. In the next video, you will hear about economic freedom and political protection. So let's start with religious liberty. We are becoming American. So in the 1620s, we see the Puritans settling in Massachusetts after escaping persecution. And we talked about this in our last lecture, that different people are traveling to the colonies for different reasons. The three main themes of European exploration: glory, God, and gold. But a lot of people coming from the British are escaping religious persecution. In 1634, we see a famous figure, Anne Hutchinson, arriving in Boston, but she likes to rock the boat a little bit, and she's banished in 1638 for her religious views, which included her leading some worship services, some Bible studies, if you will, in her home. In 1636, Roger Williams founded Providence and Rhode Island after being banished, once again, from Massachusetts for new and dangerous opinions calling for religious and political freedoms. Now, what are these new and dangerous opinions? Well, probably one of the biggest ones is the separation of church and state. Now, to us, it only makes sense to not have the church being overly involved in the state, at least from an American mindset, because which church is going to hold sway? Well, we're not too far out from the Protestant Reformation. In fact, there are religious wars going on in Europe during this time. So you have Roger Williams who's saying, look, we can't have the church in control of the government. They must be separate entities. Also, part of the Reformation, we see several different religious groups springing forth from the Protestant Reformation. And there are some of these groups, like the Anabaptists, who believed, well, they have varying beliefs, but a group of Anabaptists believed that one could not be both Christian and a politician. So, perhaps Williams was coming out of that line of thought, but he wanted a separation of church and state. Just 10 years later, 1646, Massachusetts approved a law making religious heresy punishable by death. So let's look at this. Where are they going? Well, they've landed in Massachusetts because of religious persecution. They're escaping religious persecution. And the idea was they wanted to establish a city on a hill, a place devoted to God, a theocracy, if you will, sort of a God-controlled government. And then we have others arriving in the colony. And because they are teaching or preaching different things than the Puritans are reacting rather harshly, which is somewhat understandable. Again, we have to study the past for the past's sake. We're not saying that anything that people do in the name of religion in terms of killing others, it's not right. That's not in any way biblical. But if we look at the past and we place ourselves in the past in the same manner that we would place ourselves in a foreign country, then we have to understand that this was how the church would handle dissent and heresy, teaching something other than what was considered biblical. So 1646, we have this law which made religious heresy punishable by death. And about 50 years later, we have the Salem witch trials. We tend to think that the Salem witch trials were so much bigger than what they were. It was a horrible period of unnecessary executions, torture, and things of that nature. It lasted for not very long, and the fervor died down very quickly. So in many ways, it's a blip on the radar. We just like to kind of blow it up and have movies about it and all that kind of stuff. In 1700, we see Massachusetts once again passing another law, and it's very much like a religious law, and it's ordering all Roman Catholic priests to leave the colony within 3 months upon penalty of life imprisonment or execution. And then we see New York passing a similar law. Now, why would they do that? Why would Massachusetts pass a law ordering all Roman Catholic priests to leave the colony? Well, let's look at who's settling there. Who's settling there? Who has settled there? The Puritans. Are the Puritans Catholic? No. Puritans are not Catholic. They're Protestant. And during this time, again, we've kind of, by 1700, we're out of the religious wars, but there's still tension. There's still sort of some consternation, as it were, between Protestants and Catholics. So again, if we place ourselves in the past in the same way we would place ourselves in a foreign country, it starts to kind of make sense, at least in whatever way it can. One of the great theological fathers in America, Jonathan Edwards. We see 1734, the start of the First Great Awakening, beginning in, guess where? Massachusetts. So they seem to be on sort of a spiritual roller coaster. The movement lasted 10 years, and it spread to all American colonies. Jonathan Edwards was one of the biggies. He's one of the guys leading this. He sees almost 300 new members joining his church between 1733 and 34. But as revival spreads through the next year, it also starts to die down. And Jonathan Edwards does, he becomes sad over this and whatnot. But George Whitefield, whom we'll talk about in a minute, arrives from England, and Jonathan Edwards has sort of revived himself, and we see revival returning. And Jonathan Edwards is really known for his sermon that someone titled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." This sermon actually is about it's about grace. It's about the grace of God. But there's a lot of secular historians who have taken it and they've plucked out these particular phrases that just sound so angry. And if we had more time, we would look at the entire sermon. But it's a really, really interesting and very deep treatise on the grace of God and on the wrath of God. What's interesting is that Jonathan Edwards, this man that we see as being a great theologian, was actually dismissed from his church in 1750 because he refused to serve the Lord's Supper to people he believed who were not saved. Now, no matter where you land on the position of, oh, well, who is one to say if one is saved or not, Jonathan Edwards believed that he, as the shepherd of his flock, would be administering death, if you will. In Corinthians, Paul talks about not partaking of the bread or the wine if you have not, examined yourself, if you haven't been cleansed by Jesus' blood, lest you eat and drink condemnation on yourself. So Jonathan Edwards was trying to protect some people, and this made people angry. And so he was dismissed, and he went from there to minister to a Native American people group, the Housatonics. That didn't last very long, because in 1758 he became president of Princeton, but there was a smallpox epidemic. He decided to inoculate himself. It's a very, very, very early form of vaccines, and it didn't work. He died from the inoculation. A lot of people did. But he's also known for his descendants, 3 sons, 8 daughters. Particularly, he was grandfather to Aaron Burr. Probably remember that name. Now, George Whitefield, who's that? Well, he is British. He's an Anglican priest. And, of course, the train would come by right now. I have no idea if you can hear that in the background, but I can. Now, I say he started revival in Britain, but we know it is not men who starts revival, it is the Lord. But George Whitefield was the vessel that God used to begin revival in Britain. In 1739 to 40, as mentioned earlier, he traveled to the American colonies, where he became very good friends with Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin never accepted Christ. He was not a Christian. He was a deist. But they became very, very good friends. Something else that Whitefield is known for, and we must remember that, again, these people who are pillars of the faith, we must remember that there is only one without sin, and that is the Christ. So George Whitefield started an orphanage down in Georgia, and very, very, very openly opposed the abolition of the slaves. And the reason was so that the orphanage could continue to operate on a shoestring budget. So again, we have to take everything sort of as it is. This is the past, and in George Whitefield's mind, this was perfectly acceptable. So let's always look with caution on our pillars of the faith. Now, a part of this religious fervor, we see a tremendous emphasis on individual Bible reading. So in the American colonies, we actually have a much higher literacy rate than what you're going to find anywhere else in the Western world, because of this emphasis on reading the Bible in order to understand God's will and in order to know how to live the way that God would want you to live. We also start to see the decentralization of denominations. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of denominations wanted to make sure they didn't look anything like the Catholics. So we see some new denominations cropping up, the Baptist, the Methodist, the New Light Presbyterian, and these guys are going to be autonomous in structure. There's not really going to be a hierarchy, if you will, within the denomination. We also see a change in the ministers' education, because there was this emphasis on your vocation, God's calling, and if one was called into the ministry because of the individual Bible reading, because of the light of Christ which was in you, then you would be able to read the Bible, to understand it, and to preach the word truthfully and faithfully. Now, this is kind of dangerous, because we can say, yes, the Holy Spirit does give us illumination on certain texts, and He brings certain things to our attention. However, this also leads to cults developing, and it leads to different theological ideas which are very much not biblical. And so we see, eventually in the 19th century, we see various new denominations beginning to crop up that refer to themselves as being Christian, when in actuality they are not. So it is, both slightly liberating, but if one is not highly disciplined, it can be rather dangerous. So with ministers not having the need for education, we see them writing about preaching wherever there's a stump where they can get up above people and start preaching. And these guys are known as the circuit riders, or the itinerant preachers, who travel around preaching the gospel, and it's really limited to that. It's limited to Jesus is the Son of God. He died for you. He rose from the grave for you. Come poor, lost, undone sinner. Come just as you are to Christ, as George Whitefield said. And that was really sort of the limit. There is not a lot of going deeper into other issues. And there was an expectation of a more emotional response, whereas before one would sit quietly, not speak, not move in church. Now there was the hope and the expectation that one would actually respond emotionally to the movement of the Spirit. Please disregard this question. This is not a homework question. However, you can look at it on the PowerPoints tab on the portal to give you an idea of an essay question that might be coming your way on the exam. That's the end of this lecture. Next time we'll be getting into economic freedom and political protection.